So I read the text for this week and I thought, that doesn't apply to us. I mean, look, it says, don't worry about life. And then it qualifies life by saying, you know, what you have to eat and drink, or whatever clothes you might have, don't worry about that. When was the last time you worried about whether or not you were going to eat? When was the last time I worried that I might not have clothes to wear? When was the last time any of us suburbanites worried about whether or not we were going to have housing? I mean, what does this text have to do with us, really? Because we don't fit the ancient category of people that Jesus was talking to, right? Yeah, we don't. I mean, here were poor peasant people living in a militarily occupied country, taxed both by the Roman government and by the temple. And Jesus says to those people, look at the lilies. They look better than Solomon. And Jesus says to those people, look at the birds. God provides for them. So, what does this have to do with us? Well, I have a cheat sheet here somewhere. What it has to do with us is even though we don't have those things to worry about, guess what? We worry. National Institute of Health. That was a very smooth transition, by the way, wasn't it? Just love how I did. You could barely tell that I was getting something out of my pocket. The National Institute of Mental Health reveals this in one of their studies. 40% of what we worry about will never happen. 30% of what we worry about has already happened. 12% of what we worry about is unfounded criticism from other people. 10% of what we worry about is about health worries that won't happen. 8% of what we worry about are the actual problems that we can do something about. This means that 92% of the things that we worry about, we don't need to worry about. And by the way, worrying about the 8% that we can do something about it doesn't help either. Which is, of course, what Jesus said. Can you add an hour to your life by worrying? Can you add, an inch or two to your height? Can you take a few pounds off? No, you can't do that. Evidently, we are a culture of worry, even though we have little to no reason to worry. And you might think the statistics to be a little silly, but the things that we do to deal with this worry are often very destructive. We overwork ourselves. We overeat. We overdrink. We smoke. We do any variety of number of things to kind of numb this gnawing sense of worry that is loose in our culture. And Jesus' message is simple, and it's to these people who have something to worry about, but evidently we need this message too. And it's simply this: trust God, because God will provide. Straightforward message. I've got to tell you, I've had struggles with that message in my life. When I was in seminary, I had to write a paper that had to do with the influences on my faith. And that entire paper, almost all of it, was written about my grandma and grandpa Meyer, who had a great influence on my faith. And I've told you some stories about them before. And I wrote the paper. In the first part of it, I said that they believed things that I couldn't believe. They believed in God in ways that I couldn't believe. You know, they believed that the world was created in 7 days. That's it. Jonah was swallowed by a whale or a great fish and then puked upon land somewhere. And that's it. And Jesus, by the way, walked on water, and it was like a solid oak floor. And that's the way it was. And I was their grandkid, so I didn't say anything about my hesitation in my early teens, you know, about those things, because I respected them. So that was what the first part of the paper was about. And then the second part of the paper was that I really wanted to be like them, because they were so happy, so carefree, so generous, so often joyful. I mean, these were people who lived on the wrong side of the tracks in Charles City, Iowa, in a tar paper shack that had roof shingles on the side of their house as well as the top of their house. They had no indoor bathrooms. They had an outhouse that was a two-seater. They had no hot water. Yeah, I know. Why do we need that detail? Too much information. Okay, get that image out of your mind. Erase. They never owned a new car. My grandpa always got cars that other people had trashed. And they were broken down in some yard, and he'd knock on the door and say, "Could I take a look at that? Maybe it's fixable." And then, son of a gun, he would fix it. Yeah. It was pretty amazing, the kind of people that they were. Whenever anything would go bad, they would repeat this phrase, "God will provide." Don't worry. God will provide. And I know that I'm their grandkid, and they probably protected me from some of the anxieties that they had in life. But nonetheless, it seemed to be so true. Their church burned down in the late 50s. And when that church burned down, it was a horrible event. But they all said, "God will provide." And everybody gave something. Some people had more money to give. Some people had more time to give. My grandpa, he had a cinder block maker. He made a single cinder block at one time by dumping the goop into this form, you know, and then shoving it into a little oven so that it baked up into what we know as a cinder block. He made every cinder block that rebuilt that 200-seat sanctuary, larger than this room, with a vaulted ceiling. Every one of those cinder blocks came out one at a time from this silly little cinder block maker. And they all put the church up together. And a year and a half later, what did they say? They said, "God provided." And as a little kid, or a teenager, I looked and said, "Wait, didn't you guys do all the work?" And they would have looked back at me and gone, "You're crazy, son. God provided." You know? On Saturday nights, my grandma would pull the tub out in the middle of the kitchen floor, the big metal tub, and she would pour boiling hot water into it that my brother and I were supposed to get into to wash up for Sunday, you know. And then we'd stand around and while she poured cold water in it and then just dip our toe into it to make sure it wouldn't make us lobsters, you know, when we got in. She'd wash us up, then she'd lay out our clothes for the next day. And she would have a white shirt and one of those fake clip-on ties that we would wear. And then on Sunday morning before she left, she would say, "Boys, before you go," then she would open up a little envelope of money that my mom and dad sent with my brother and me. We would stay there for 2 weeks at a time. And she would say, "Here's a quarter for each of you. Your parents sent $5. So half of that is $2.50. So each week you should give 10% of what you have to God. Okay?" We'd go, "Okay, Grandma." she'd put it in our hands and we'd hold it tight and we'd get to church. And then when the plate would come down the row, she would look over at us, go, just to make sure we didn't like shove it into our pocket and keep it for ourselves, and we'd have to open it up and let it fall in. And then she would have taken her own envelope and she would have taken 10% out of that and she would have dropped it into the plate. And I can remember as an early teenager thinking, Grandma, you are really poor. Do you know how poor you are? You don't really know how poor you are. You're giving 10% of this away to the church. You could use that money. God will provide. That would be her answer. God will provide. One day my cousin Bobby and I, we went outside the house after she had repeated yet again, God will provide. We're playing catch. My cousin Bobby's a pretty strapping young fellow, and he turned and he whipped that ball at me so hard, and I caught that ball in my old hand-me-down glove that had almost no padding in it. Ouch! It really hurt, and I took the ball and I threw the glove on the ground and I rubbed my hand. It was like, ah! Well, this is awful. And then I said somewhat sarcastically, maybe God will provide a new glove. And out of the open kitchen window, my grandma's voice comes, Dennis Paul! God does not provide for greed, but for need. If you've got trouble with that, you bring it in here. I have a lot of rags. I can just open that thing up and put some padding in it, sew it back up again, be good as new. And she did. She and I had a different definition of greed. See, I thought maybe it wasn't greedy to want a new mitt. But she had a point, didn't she? God will provide. So this is what I laid out in my paper, and my professor called me in to talk about it. He said, seems like you have a problem here, don't you? I said, yeah. He said, well, how would you put it? I said, well, I don't believe the same way that my grandparents believe, yet I know that it's their faith that gives them such deep sense of joy and makes them into kind and generous people. And I want to be like that, but I believe in a God that's different. Oh, he said, what God is that? And I said, well, then I put my very smart seminary hat on. I said, well, Paul Tillich, the great theologian, he said that God is the ground of being. And I like that idea, because now God isn't like meddling with humankind and all of that. I think that's really a great idea. What I didn't know at the time was that this seminary professor had studied at Harvard under Paul Tillich when he was there. He knew everything about the ground of being. He knew much more than I knew about what Paul Tillich meant about the ground of being. So he sat back for a moment, and then he sat forward. He said, are you telling me that you don't think the ground of being provides for your life? Are you telling me that you don't think that all of creation flourishes and enables your life to flourish? Are you telling me that you don't think the ground of human being enables you to love and to be loved? Are you telling me that you don't think the ground of your very own being, Dennis Moon, are you telling me that you don't think that the ground of your being is calling you with your gifts to help heal the world? Is that what you're saying? And I was stunned. He said, your grandma and grandpa They are not generous, kind, free people because they believe that the world was created in 7 days, or that Jonah was swallowed and puked up by a fish, or that Jesus walked on water. That's not why they are kind people. They are kind and wonderful people because they trust the God that they believe in to nourish their lives. You have a decision to make. I said, what? What decision? I said, you have to decide whether or not this God thing is just going to remain an idea in your head, or if it's going to get down to the level of your heart. And you're going to see God not just on Sundays in church, but you're going to see God out there everywhere, at work, between people and among people and within people in all kinds of different serendipitous ways. But you have to make that decision. Because the only way you're going to know that you can trust the God you believe in is if you put that God to the test. You have to get out there. You have to be the one who is kind to those people that maybe you would rather not be kind to. You have to be the one who's willing to open your household to people and let them come in like they did. You have to be the one who is willing to give money away because you believe that God will provide. If you don't do that, you'll never find out. You have to go all the way in. You have to go over the edge. I got my own personal sermon. And I have to say, the rest of my life has been walking that path, trying to understand how it is that I go all the way in, not holding back, but trusting that God will actually provide. And I try. Okay, I'm here to say I think I've improved. I mean, I try to be open to people who are different than I am and have different ideas than I do. And I try to be generous with our resources and our home. It's a real struggle. I don't give the 10% to the church that my grandma and grandpa Meyer did. But I'm working at it. I'm trying to make our way to 5%. This year it's $3,400. It's 2/3 the way to 5%. And I tell that to you to say that, you know what? Your minister struggles with this thing too. Look at the birds of the field. Look at the lilies. God provides for them. Don't you just want to go all the way in and say, God, I trust you. I trust your call. Let me prove it out. This is what Jesus meant in the text when he said, first of all, seek the kingdom of God. And then everything else is going to follow. God will provide for your need, not your greed. Seek first the kingdom of God. That's what Jesus did. And because of that, we have that table at which we will be nourished momentarily from the fullness of his risk and his trust and his joy and the abundant life that he has.